10,000 tents went up over a weekend. 10,000 tents. Where did they come from? Food materialized that from the very, very beginning to feed tens of thousands and eventually more people. A lot of Ukrainians paid for that, but there was a lot of money and a lot of organization in place. There was a mobilization of people from outside of Kiev to come, buses that arrived. All of this had been done well in advance.
There was even a protocol for how we march today?
There was. Well, the Ukrainians are very disciplined. I mean, I've seen in Serbia it wasn't quite like this, but the Ukrainians know how to take orders. And it was fascinating that some of the people could just simply say, all right, we're all going to the parliament now. And they would all go to the parliament immediately, so they were able to follow orders. I have to say, this, even though there is this evidence of this massive organization, that there were the hundreds of thousands of people, eventually almost 1 million people you saw on the square, were not paid to be there. They couldn't have been. They were there because they wanted to be there. But there were an awful lot of things as I was watching it. I thought, I've seen this movie before. And the first thing I connected it with was the revolution in Serbia in 2000. Not just because so many of the same tactics, so many of the same kind of procedures happened in Serbia, but I realized that so many of the same people were there. So many of the same funding agencies were there. Sure enough, it turns out that the Serbian revolutionaries who overthrew Milosevic and the people who helped to fund them were the people who trained the Ukrainians over a period of years in how to do nonviolent revolution.
The Orange Revolution in Ukraine is somehow linked to the Rose Revolution in Georgia, to the fall of Milosevic in Serbia. What are the connections?
It's so fascinating. It's a carbon copy of the revolution in Georgia when Edward Shevardnadze was removed from power and a guy named Mikhail Saakashvili took power. Not only exactly the same symbols, this fist on a background. They had in Georgia they had something called Kmara. In Serbia it was Otpor. In Ukraine it was called Pora. They developed this as a Madison Avenue style branding that was developed. They were all trained in how to do this by people that came from the United States. There had been a training camp in Hungary before the Serbian Revolution, financed by George Soros and by the International Republican Institute, funding wing of the Republican Party, that paid for an American colonel to train them in how to do these kinds of activities. Exactly the same revolution in Georgia, plus the same people. Same ambassador, American ambassador who was in Georgia for the revolution, for the overthrow of Shevardnadze, had been the guy in charge of the embassy in Belgrade when Milosevic had to go. And I asked him, I said, coincidence? He said, oh, you're reading too much into this. I don't think so.
So if the animators, in many cases, the funders, in all three cases, are in large part the American government, or its tributaries, if you will, Hungarian billionaire George Soros, one of the richest men in the world, is there any reason to wonder at motivation or be more concerned about the fact that so much power is concentrated in so few hands for so long? Because this didn't just happen in a couple of weeks, months. This went on for years.
10 years. And they all told me that they've been doing this, what they call democracy building or civil society building for 10 years. I went into this project, to this investigation, with probably a very cynical mindset, looking for, the sinister underbelly of this. I have to say, I don't find it. I mean, I think that there are too many conflicting interests. Maybe they do have agendas, and I think it's not a coincidence that Serbia, Georgia, and Ukrainian opposition leaders were all free market reformers with the World Bank stamp of approval. I don't think that was an accident, but they were the legitimate opposition leaders that the people wanted. What these young people needed who ran these revolutions was they needed the money. They needed the money to be able to do what they thought was right. That these were extraordinarily corrupt and even criminal regimes. They were not going to go through elections. They were not going to go through normal means. Extraordinary means were required to get rid of these governments, and they needed money in order to do that.
How much money are we talking about?
We're talking about, if you count it just as strictly democracy building, it's hundreds of millions. But but we're talking about billions probably if you count all the other kinds of investments that are kind of gray area things that the American government, European governments, European unions, not just Washington's, Brussels as well, and all these private foundations like George Soros. We're talking about billions of dollars.
So this pro-democratic apparatus, this pro-democratic revolutionary juggernaut is in place. Does it just fall down now? Or does it remain in place, and if it is, where is it looking? What are its...
All of the young people that we met who were part of this, the training, the ones who had the initial training and by this colonel, this CIA colonel in Budapest, to the ones who just joined up in Ukraine, there were a lot of Russians who were in the square in Kiev, who were joining the revolution, who were learning the techniques. Initially, apparently, Vladimir Putin said there'd be never any orange revolution in Russia. But having watched what happened in Ukraine, everybody in Russia now says, whoa, if it can happen in Ukraine, those Georgians, those Serbs, they're kind of crazy. You know, we're cool. We're not like them. But the Ukrainians, they're like kissing cousins. And so it's just too close for comfort. Vladimir Putin is already closing down, you know, kind of way that he does it by charging high taxes, closing down the Soros Institutes. He's closing down the NGOs. He's very, very aware that the possibility that an orange revolution could be cooked up in his country, and he's determined to stop that.
Carol, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rick.